there are mobile phones that sell in Liverpool for £100,000.
Drug gangs are making $4 billion a year in Britain and using people as young as 12 as part of their trade. Those are among the facts in a new report from The Times Online now. It's got an exclusive feature looking into the drugs trade and the areas facing a surge in violence brought about by the gangs. The revelations are part of a new podcast series from The Times and Sunday Times called Cocaine Inc. with Will Rowe and David Collins. David joined me earlier today giving us details on how the drug trade has affected the Woodchurch community in the Wirral.
Essentially, one gang which kind of operates there, it deals in a number of drugs, but cocaine is one of the main ones. They've been feuding with another gang, which is in the Beechwood estate, which is essentially, they're divided by a motorway in the Wirral. And there's a bridge that kind of goes between both the estates. The young people do not cross the bridge. They're from the other estate. They don't dare go into, the rival estate. And I mean, the Woodchurch estate, it'd be a group of young men. One of them was Connor Chapman, who we know that basically Connor was sentenced last year for murdering Ellie Edwards. So Ellie was basically outside a pub on Christmas Eve in 2022. She went outside for a cigarette. She was standing near a couple of Connor's rivals when Connor turned up and started firing into the pub with a submachine gun. And that was part of a kind of a feud between the Woodchurch estate gang and that neighbouring estate. It's a group of kind of young men who have access to machine guns. You use them.
And look, we know that a lot of the cocaine dealers themselves are incredibly young. Does this mean the gangs themselves are entirely young, or are they kind of sort of older people pulling the strings?
Generally speaking, in organised crime, the younger you are, the lower down the food chain you are, which does make sense. But a lot of kind of even high-level drug dealers, they kind of retire in their early 30s. I mean, it's not something that is kind of has good long-term prospects. Yeah. So what you have, generally speaking, is you've got kind of, you could have people aged 12, 13, 14, very young teenagers who are working for the gang. They might be doing a bit of transportation, a bit of dealing, simple deliveries, for example. Then you get a little bit older. Then you're responsible for, the money being gathered in, or the kind of getting the drugs in themselves from whatever whatever wholesaler they use. So it is a mixture. But I'd say the Woodchurch estate gang they'll be using kind of very young kids. The people probably running it at a street level will be in their 20s. And then above them, there'll be a higher tier of criminal who may or may not be in the Woodchurch area. They may be somewhere else entirely.
And these very young kids, the sort of the foot soldiers and the immediate dealers, what are their lives like generally? Presumably there's not much sort of like parental influence here. There's certainly no school influence, nothing like that.
Yeah. Utterly chaotic is the answer. During doing this kind of podcast series, where this episode of Cocaine Inc. looks in depth into the Woodchurch estate, we got an interview with this young lad in his 20s. We call him Johnny. We've given him a name for his own safety, because if the gang knew he was talking to us, he'd be shot. That's what he told us. So he gave us an interview, and he gave us a real insight into their lives. The interesting thing that I thought, I've reported on crime for like 20 years, and a lot of the reporting you see, there's a lot of it that focuses on these gangs, but it's a turf war. It's all about money. They want to control the postcode, the streets, the customers. And what Johnny was telling us was, well, that's a bit of it, but actually, a lot of it is run now by social media. So they fall out on social media. They'll have a fight, beat somebody up. They'll record it on Snapchat. It will be put out there, and then that will be the cause of the feud. And then somebody's windows will get smashed in. And that's another interesting thing on these estates. Like, doing somebody's windows in, it's almost like a language. It's basically a signal by a gang to say that there's someone living in that house that is perceived as weak, and then it's up to them whether or not they want to respond. But it's just this general idea from Johnny that their lives are like chaos. They don't know what they're doing from one day to the next. An entire fallout can be over something as simple on social media, or they've shared, they fancy the same girl. It can be as simple as that.
So, I mean, look, from your reporting, obviously the drug trade is a major sort of root factor here. How much of a factor is drug use? Are these kids using the drugs they're selling, or is it all being sort of spread out of the estate to other places? Is the estate itself a kind of hotbed of drug use as well?
It's a mixture. It is a mixture, but the dealing itself isn't necessarily limited to the estate. So it depends on kind of which drugs. A street gang like this won't deal in one single drug alone. So they'll probably dabble in quite a few drugs, and different drugs are attractive to different parts of society, aren't they? So, cocaine is a party drug. It's quite expensive. They'll be dealing to the city centre, the bars, the nightclubs. That'll mean young people. That could mean students. That could mean just people in the 20s out for a good time in Liverpool. A number goes around on a mobile phone. You ring the number, and then the stash comes from the Woodchurch estate, and then it comes down to Liverpool a few miles away, and they make the delivery. And and that's the way. There are mobile phones that sell in Liverpool for £100,000.
And there's
not the mobile phone, the SIM card. The SIM cards that sell that amount, because people who use drugs have that number.
There's this enormous sort of middle-class blind spot among middle-class drug users about where the drugs come from, that there is this sort of the root of the problem is in estates like this, with gangs like this, with kids like this. Having reported on it so extensively, that must drive you slightly crazy.
I mean, it's interesting, the distance that people who use put themselves between that and the reality of people shooting themselves up on an estate like the Woodchurch estate gang. The reality is, if you're a student and you're buying a gram of coke for 50 quid on a night out, this gang is the retail end of that operation, and they are shooting each other. We've seen in 2022 was a deadly year for Merseyside. There's police there I've spoken to. We've never seen anything like it. You had the murder of Ellie. You had the murder of Olivia Pratt-Corbell, an 8-year-old who was shot in her own house when dealers fired into her home. You had Ashley Dale, a council worker, who was shot dead. Rival gangs were trying to find her boyfriend. It's all to do with the cocaine trade. All three were innocent bystanders caught up in, basically, and this is another misconception. What we did see in 2022, certainly, and last year, is the idea that these feuds, they're not being kept between the gangs. These are spilling out into normal people's lives, and we're seeing people being murdered. Certainly, Merseyside, where I've done a lot of this reporting, the escalation of violence is incredible. They now have access to Scorpion machine guns, which fire unbelievable amounts of bullets. These people are using them. They're not trained. They're not soldiers. But they're using them to shoot each other, and that's why people are getting killed.
How big is the drug trade and the cocaine trade generally in England? It's pretty massive these days.
Enormous, absolutely enormous. So they reckon, the NCA think it's worth about 4 billion. They reckon that the estimates are that we snort more than 100 tons of cocaine, or use more than 100 tons of cocaine a year in the UK. We're the second biggest user of cocaine in the world after Australia. I think that's per capita. So, this is a massive industry. The cocaine is arriving. They can't stop it because there's no way to stop it. It comes in via Holland, via the Netherlands, via containers. They can't check every container. They check less than 1% of all containers. So the authorities know they can't stop it coming in. We saw a drugs bust, actually, and this is an interesting thing, I think, that we had a drugs bust recently in Southampton, I think it was. 5 tons of cocaine was seized. That's a record in the UK. We've never seen as big a haul as that. But the reality is, the bigger gangs factor in that as a loss. That isn't so much of a loss to them, because for every 5 tons they seize, there's another 5 tons that have got in. And the authorities are not winning that war.
Researching this podcast then for Cocaine Inc., David, you've been investigating South America, Dubai, and the Netherlands, as you said. You've taken a real global view. What would you say is the sort of the big, most surprising thing and most unexpected thing you've learned during your investigation?
How easy it is to bag up cash and get it on a flight out of the UK into another country.
Mm.
So the ease in which you can do that and the amount that's probably going on, I found astonishing. I had this idea that basically when you check your bags, your suitcases in at an airport, I had this idea in my mind that they're all scanned. So how could you
Mm-hmm.
possibly have millions of pounds of cash in those suitcases? Well, the reality is, yes, they're scanned, but they're scanned for counter-terrorism purposes. So the machines are calibrated to detect threats to the plane itself. They're not calibrated to detect large amounts of cash. So if you're smuggling large amounts of money out of the country, it's relatively easy to do.
Well, that's David Collins from The Times and The Sunday Times. And you can listen to The Times' 8-part podcast series, Cocaine Inc., with Will Rowe and David, wherever you get your podcasts.